Blood, sweat, and motor oil stained the desert sand. 700 patched Hell's Angels stood in dead silence as a 23-year-old fugitive laid hands on a $2.5 million machine. One slipped wrench meant a shallow Mojave grave. One turn of the ignition meant pulling off an absolute miracle. Dust choked the arid air of the Mojave compound, a heavily fortified stretch of Nevada wasteland, strictly off-limits to anyone without a death wish. Caleb Hayes was not a particularly brave man, just a deeply desperate one. Running from a ruthless Las Vegas chop shop syndicate to whom he owed $80,000, his stolen, rust-eaten Chevy truck had finally given up the ghost precisely 1 mile from the largest gathering of Hell's Angels in a decade. It was the annual National Run. Caleb had tried to slip past the perimeter, hoping to scavenge a spark plug or some coolant from the outer edge of the encampment, but survival rarely favors the careless. 2 prospects had dragged him by his collar through the dirt, throwing him at the feet of the inner circle. He fully expected a beating, or worse. Instead, what he found was a scene of palpable, vibrating tension. In the center of the dust-blown arena, surrounded by 700 hardened bikers, sat the most magnificent and intimidating piece of machinery Caleb had ever laid eyes on. It was a custom Harley-Davidson, but calling it a mere motorcycle was a profound insult. Valued at a staggering $2.5 million, the bike was affectionately and reverently known as the Sovereign. Commissioned to honor the club's original founders, its engine casing was milled from a solid block of aerospace-grade titanium, plated in pure platinum. The speedometer bezel was lined with black diamonds, and its customized V-twin engine was a one-of-a-kind prototype designed by a legendary reclusive engineer. Standing over it, his massive arms crossed and his face thunderous, was Big Jim Carver, the national president. Beside him, the club's top mechanic, a grizzled veteran named Wrench Miller, was pale and sweating profusely under the unforgiving desert sun. "I don't want to hear about what it might be, Wrench," Big Jim rumbled, his voice like rocks in a cement mixer. "We ride in 1 hour. If the Sovereign doesn't lead the pack, the entire tribute is dead." "Jim, I'm telling you, it's seized," Wrench stammered, his grease-stained hands shaking as he held a diagnostic scanner that clearly had no business being plugged into a mechanical beast of this nature. "The starter won't even kick. It's like the pistons are welded to the walls. We need to ship it back to Milwaukee. If I tear into this platinum block here and mess up the torque specs, the whole engine shatters." A low, collective growl rippled through the hundreds of bikers. Disappointment was turning into anger. Caleb, still on his knees in the dirt with a prospect's heavy boot pressing into his back, couldn't stop himself. He was a mechanical prodigy, a savant whose only downfall was trusting the wrong people with his garage's finances. To him, engines were a second language, and the smell of the unburnt, high-octane fuel wafting from the Sovereign told him a story no scanner ever could. "It's not seized," Caleb croaked out, his throat dry from the desert dust. The immediate silence was deafening. 700 heads snapped toward the bruised, skinny kid, kneeling in the dirt. The prospect pressed his boot down harder, driving the air from Caleb's lungs, but Big Jim raised a massive hand. "Let him speak," Big Jim commanded, taking heavy, deliberate steps toward Caleb. "You got something to say, boy?" I said, "It's not seized," Caleb repeated, forcing himself to stand as the prospect backed off. "I can smell the unatomized fuel from here. If the pistons were welded, the starter wouldn't even draw enough amperage to heat the wiring harness. But I can see the insulation on your ground wire bubbling. It's trying to turn over, but something is physically blocking the intake valve from closing, locking up the compression cycle." Wrench scoffed, a nervous, defensive sound. "This kid is a stray. He doesn't know what he's talking about. It's a closed-loop titanium block." Big Jim looked from Wrench to Caleb, his steely eyes narrowing. The reputation of the club, the honor of the founders, and his own leadership were riding on the next hour. He reached into his leather vest, pulling out a heavy, gleaming Colt .45, and set it gently on the leather seat of a nearby bike. "You got a name, kid?" Big Jim asked. "Caleb." "Well, Caleb, you are going to fix my motorcycle," Big Jim stated, leaving no room for negotiation. "You have exactly 45 minutes. You get it running, you ride out of here with our protection. Any debt you owe, anywhere in the world, is gone. But if you strip a single bolt on that $2.5 million engine, you don't leave the Mojave." Caleb swallowed hard, looking at the monolithic machine, then at the sea of leather, denim, and menacing stares. He nodded slowly. "I need your toolbox, and I need everybody to step back." The tension in the air was thick enough to slice with a Bowie knife. 700 bikers formed a massive, suffocating ring around the center of the compound. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the howling of the desert wind and the metallic clinking of tools as Caleb Hayes laid out his instruments on a clean shop rag. He didn't rush. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes today meant death. He approached the Sovereign, running his bare hands over the cold platinum casing. It was a masterpiece, but even masterpieces had vulnerabilities. "Turn the ignition, just a quarter second," Caleb instructed Wrench, who was hovering nervously over his shoulder. Wrench looked to Big Jim for approval. Big Jim gave a curt nod. Wrench turned the key and hit the starter. A horrifying metallic crunch echoed from the engine block, followed by an electrical whine. Caleb signaled him to cut it immediately. "Right cylinder," Caleb muttered to himself. "Top dead center." He selected a specialized hex key and began the painstaking process of removing the custom-milled rocker box cover. Every bolt was torqued to an exact specification, and Caleb had to feel the tension through his wrists, relying purely on muscle memory and instinct to avoid stripping the soft platinum threads. As the cover finally lifted free, exposing the pristine, oil-slicked valve train, Wrench leaned in, shaking his head. "Looks perfect to me, kid. You're wasting time." Caleb ignored him, grabbing a high-powered pen light from the toolbox. He aimed the beam down past the titanium valve springs, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the gap. Suddenly, his breath hitched. He reached for a pair of extended needle-nose pliers, his hand remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He carefully snaked the pliers down into the intake port, clamping onto something tiny and foreign. Slowly, he withdrew his hand and held the object up to the sunlight. It was a small, perfectly round, tungsten carbide ball bearing. A collective gasp rippled through the front row of the crowd. Big Jim stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He snatched the bearing from Caleb's palm, examining it. "That didn't come from this engine," Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying in the dead silence. "Tungsten carbide. It's used in heavy industrial cutting tools. Somebody dropped this down the intake manifold while the air cleaner was off. When the engine tried to pull air, it sucked the bearing in, lodging it right between the valve and the seat. That's why it wouldn't turn over. It was physically wedged." The implication hung in the air like a dark cloud. A $2.5 million motorcycle, kept under lock and key, heavily guarded at all times. The only people who had access to it were patched members of the inner circle. Sabotage. Big Jim's eyes slowly scanned the faces of his closest brothers. The betrayal was staggering. "Who?" he whispered, his voice shaking with a quiet, lethal fury. "Who touched my bike?" Before a witch hunt could erupt, Caleb cleared his throat. "Mr. Carver, we have a bigger problem." Big Jim snapped his attention back to the mechanic. "What?" "The bearing," Caleb explained, pointing down into the engine block. When Wrench tried to start it earlier, the piston came up and smashed the titanium valve against that bearing. The valve stem is bent. Even with the bearing gone, it won't seal. You have zero compression in the front cylinder. The bike won't run. Wrench threw his hands up in despair. That's it. It's over. A bent titanium valve. You need a machine shop, a micro lathe, and a replacement valve from the manufacturer. We are in the middle of the damn desert. The crowd began to murmur anxiously. The realization that their national tribute was ruined was setting in. But Caleb didn't step away from the bike. Instead, his eyes darted around the compound, scanning the makeshift repair bays, the scattered parts, and the raw materials surrounding them. I don't need a machine shop, Caleb said, his voice suddenly firm. I need an electric drill, a piece of thick plate glass, some fine grit valve lapping compound, and the vice grip from your workbench. Big Jim stared at him, bewildered. You're going to machine a bent titanium valve in the dirt? I'm going to straighten it, recut the seat angle by hand, and lap it until it holds pressure, Caleb replied, already rolling up his sleeves. But I need 30 minutes, and I need absolutely nobody to interrupt me. From the back of the inner circle, a tall, scarred man with cold eyes stepped forward. It was Wyatt, the national vice president. This is insane, Jim, Wyatt sneered, glaring at Caleb. The kid's stalling. Let me put a bullet in him, and we'll ride out on our own bikes. The Sovereign is dead. Caleb caught the subtle flinch in Wyatt's jaw. A nervous tick. He remembered seeing Wyatt hovering near the repair tent when the prospects had first dragged him in. If I'm stalling, Caleb said, looking dead into Wyatt's eyes, then you can pull the trigger yourself. But if you want to see this bike lead the run, you'll get me that drill. Big Jim looked between his vice president and the runaway mechanic. The desert wind howled, kicking up a dust devil that swept past the gleaming motorcycle. Get the boy his tools, Big Jim ordered, his hand resting heavily on the butt of his pistol. The clock is ticking. High noon in the Mojave Desert was unforgiving, baking the hard-packed earth and turning the air into a shimmering, suffocating haze. Inside the human wall of 700 bikers, the heat was even more oppressive. Caleb Hayes knelt in the dirt, sweat stinging his eyes, assembling a makeshift machine shop on the tailgate of Wrench's battered support truck. He had demanded a specific set of items, a heavy-duty electric drill, a thick pane of safety glass salvaged from a broken display case, a tube of fine grit silicon carbide lapping compound, and a heavy bench vise. Wrench had provided them with a mixture of profound skepticism and desperate hope. Wyatt, the national vice president, paced near the front of the crowd like a caged wolf, his eyes darting between Big Jim and the young mechanic. You have 34 minutes left, boy, Big Jim stated, checking a massive silver chronograph on his thick wrist. He hadn't moved from his spot beside the crippled $2.5 million motorcycle, his hand still resting ominously near the Colt .45 on the leather saddle. I know, Caleb replied, his voice strained as he clamped the heavy vise onto the truck's tailgate. He couldn't afford to think about the gun, the debt he owed in Vegas, or the hundreds of heavily armed men watching his every breath. He had to disappear into the mechanics. Caleb carefully retrieved the bent titanium valve. The stem was visibly warped, only by a fraction of a millimeter. But in a high-compression engine, a fraction of a millimeter might as well be a mile. Using a pair of brass-jawed pliers to protect the delicate titanium, he slowly, painstakingly, began to bend the stem back into alignment. It was an agonizing process. Titanium was notoriously brittle under cold stress. Bend it too fast or too far, and it would snap. If it snapped, Caleb's life was officially over. The silence in the camp was absolute, save for the hum of the desert wind and the grinding of Caleb's teeth. He applied pressure, released, checked the straightness against the flat pane of safety glass, and repeated. Drop by agonizing drop, the sweat pooled at his collar. After 10 minutes of excruciatingly slow adjustments, the valve rolled perfectly flat across the glass. A collective, quiet sigh rippled through the front row of the crowd. But Caleb wasn't smiling. "Straightening it is only half the battle," Caleb muttered, loud enough for Wrench to hear. The impact against that tungsten bearing chewed up the valve face. It won't seat against the cylinder head. It's going to leak compression like a sieve. "So we are dead in the water," Wyatt interjected, stepping forward with a triumphant sneer. "Jim, this is a circus. The kid is playing with scrap metal while our charter's reputation burns. Let's pack it up." "Shut your mouth, Wyatt," Big Jim growled, his voice dangerously low. "The kid has 20 minutes. Let him work." Caleb grabbed the electric drill and carefully chucked the straight end of the valve stem into the jaws, tightening it down just enough to hold it secure without scoring the metal. He laid the pane of safety glass flat on the tailgate, smeared a thick dollop of the grey lapping compound onto the center, and flipped the drill into reverse. He pressed the chewed-up face of the valve against the abrasive paste on the glass and pulled the trigger. The drill whined, spinning the valve against the grit. Caleb was effectively creating a crude, handheld lathe, using the perfectly flat surface of the glass to grind a fresh, uniform 45-degree angle back into the damaged titanium. Sparks didn't fly. Titanium doesn't spark like steel, but a sharp, acrid smell of hot metal and burning grease filled the air. Caleb modulated the speed of the drill with surgical precision, feeling the vibrations through his forearms. He had learned this trick from an old-timer in Reno who built dirt track racers out of junkyard scraps. A man who taught Caleb that the machine didn't care about your zip code, only your math and your geometry. "Keep it steady," Wrench whispered, suddenly leaning in close, his previous skepticism replaced by sheer, mechanical fascination. "If you wobble even a degree, you'll cut an oval into the face and ruin the seal forever." "I know," Caleb grunted, his arms burning from the tension. 10 minutes passed. The grinding sound smoothed out, transitioning from a harsh scrape to a smooth, rhythmic hiss. Caleb stopped the drill, wiped the valve face clean with a rag, and inspected it under the penlight. A perfect, dull grey ring circled the edge of the valve, a fresh, flawlessly flat sealing surface. "Now for the hard part," Caleb breathed, turning back to the monumental engine block of the Sovereign. He dropped the newly machined valve back into the cylinder head. He coated the rim with more lapping compound, attached a suction cup tool to the top of the valve, and began twisting it back and forth by hand against the engine block's seat. Grind, release, turn. Grind, release, turn. He was marrying the two pieces of metal together, forcing them to wear into each other's microscopic grooves until they formed a perfectly airtight, custom seal. With exactly 7 minutes remaining on Big Jim's watch, Caleb wiped away the excess compound, blasted the port with compressed air from a can Wrench provided, and reassembled the valve spring, retainers and rocker arm. His hands were blistered, his knuckles bleeding from slipping against the sharp platinum cooling fins, but he moved with a frantic, fluid grace. He reached for the torque wrench, setting the dial to the exact factory specification he had memorized years ago from a leaked engineering schematic. Click. The first bolt locked down. Click. 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 As he secured the platinum rocker box cover back onto the engine, he paused. He looked down into the valley of the V-twin cylinders, right where he had extracted the sabotage bearing. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the heavy tungsten sphere. "Done," Caleb announced, stepping back from the motorcycle and dropping his tools onto the dirt. He wiped his greasy hands on his jeans, chest heaving. Big Jim stepped forward, the massive crowd leaning in so far that the human circle physically shrank. "You sure, boy?" "I'm sure," Caleb said, his eyes locking briefly with Wyatt's. "But before you turn that key, "I need to show you something." The tension in the desert air was suddenly thick enough to suffocate a man. Big Jim stopped, his hand hovering over the ignition switch. He looked at Caleb, his heavy brow furrowing. "I told you to fix my bike, Caleb. I didn't ask for a presentation." "You want to know why your bike broke in the first place?" Caleb replied, his voice remarkably steady for a man standing in a circle of outlaws. He pulled the tungsten carbide bearing out of his pocket and held it up. "This didn't just fall from the sky. Somebody put it there. But when I pulled it out of the intake manifold, I noticed something." Wyatt stepped forward, his hand dropping casually toward the heavy hunting knife sheathed at his hip. "Jim, the kid is buying time because he knows the engine is going to blow the second you hit the starter. Put him on his knees." "Let the boy speak," Big Jim commanded, not taking his eyes off Caleb. Caleb tossed the small, heavy ball bearing to wrench. The seasoned mechanic caught it, looking bewildered. "Look closely at the grease on that bearing wrench," Caleb instructed. "It's not engine oil. It's thick, it's tacky, and it's got a distinct cherry red color. It's synthetic lithium complex grease." Wrench squinted at the bearing, rubbing his thumb over the surface. "Yeah. So? We use all kinds of grease in the shop." "Not that kind," Caleb countered. "That specific grease is a high-temperature aviation blend. It's ridiculously expensive and usually only used on high-stress wheel bearings. I noticed it because I used to work on private jets before my life went sideways. Nobody uses that on a motorcycle engine." Caleb paused, taking a slow breath. "Unless they are obsessed with packing their own custom wheel hubs." A heavy, dangerous silence fell over the inner circle. Big Jim slowly turned his massive head, his gaze landing squarely on Wyatt. Every patched member in the Nevada Charter knew about Wyatt's obsession with his front wheel assembly. A year ago, a seized bearing at 90 miles per hour had nearly killed him, leaving him with a nasty scar across his jaw. Since then, Wyatt was notoriously paranoid, importing specialized red aviation grease to pack his wheel bearings himself, refusing to let even Wrench touch his motorcycle. "That's a hell of a story, kid," Wyatt sneered, but the subtle tremor in his voice betrayed him. He took a step backward, his eyes darting toward the perimeter of the camp. "You're going to let a stray rat from Vegas tear this club apart with a fairy tale?" "It's no fairy tale," Caleb said, pointing to Wyatt's leather boots. "There's a smear of that same red grease on the side of your right boot. You must have dropped the bearing, caught it against your leg, and picked it up before dropping it down the Sovereign's intake." All eyes dropped to Wyatt's boot. There, distinct against the dusty black leather, was a bright, unmistakable smudge of cherry red grease. The realization washed over the crowd like a shockwave. Wyatt had sabotaged the club's most sacred tribute. If the Sovereign failed to lead the run, Big Jim would be deeply humiliated, his leadership questioned by the National Council. It was a calculated, cowardly play for the president's patch. Big Jim didn't yell. He didn't curse. The terrifying calm that settled over the giant man was far more lethal than any outburst. He slowly reached down and picked up the Colt 45 from the leather saddle. "Wyatt," Big Jim said, his voice echoing like a tomb closing. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He knew the laws of the club. Betrayal at this level carried only one sentence. He unholstered his weapon with lightning speed, aiming directly at Big Jim's chest. But 700 men were watching. Before Wyatt could even squeeze the trigger, Wrench swung a heavy steel tire iron, cracking it viciously against Wyatt's wrist. The gun went flying into the dirt. In a fraction of a second, 3 massive enforcers were on Wyatt, dragging him to the ground in a violently subdued struggle, kicking up a massive cloud of Mojave dust. Big Jim didn't even flinch. He watched coldly as his former vice president was hauled away toward the back of the compound, his fate sealed in the unspoken laws of the Outlaw Brotherhood. Slowly, Big Jim turned his attention back to the $2.5 million motorcycle, and then to the battered, exhausted, 23-year-old mechanic standing beside it. "Moment of truth, Caleb," Big Jim said softly. He slid the key into the ignition. He flipped the kill switch. The fuel pump whined, pressurizing the massive lines. The entire camp held its collective breath. 700 men stood utterly motionless. Big Jim thumbed the starter. The starter motor engaged with a heavy metallic crunch. The massive pistons fought against the high compression, struggling for a fraction of a second. Then the spark plugs fired. Boom, rumble, rumble, rumble. The Sovereign erupted to life with a concussive, thunderous roar that shook the very ground under their boots. The exhaust note was a symphony of perfectly timed explosions, deep, guttural, and flawless. The massive V-twin idled smoothly, the repaired titanium valve sealing perfectly, holding maximum compression with every stroke. The platinum engine block gleamed in the desert sun, vibrating with raw, unadulterated power. For 5 seconds, the only sound in the Nevada desert was the magnificent idle of a $2.5 million machine. Then, the crowd erupted. 700 Hell's Angels broke into a deafening cheer, revving their own engines, raising their fists, and pounding each other on the back. The sound of celebration drowned out the howling desert wind. Wrench grabbed Caleb by the shoulders, shaking him in disbelief, a massive, grease-stained grin on his face. Big Jim sat on the bike, feeling the perfect rhythm of the engine beneath him. He looked down at Caleb, his hard eyes softening just a fraction. He reached into his leather vest, pulled out a thick, banded stack of $100 bills, and tossed it into Caleb's chest. "That covers your 80 grand in Vegas," Big Jim roared over the sound of the engine. "And the extra 20 is for the oil change. You ride out of here in my personal support truck. Anyone in Nevada looks at you wrong, you tell them they answer to the Hell's Angels." Caleb caught the money, his hands shaking, a massive wave of relief crashing over him. He had walked into the jaws of death with nothing but an electric drill and some glass, and he was walking out a free man. Big Jim kicked the Sovereign into gear, the heavy clunk echoing through the chassis. He raised his left fist high into the air. 700 bikers simultaneously dropped their visors and kicked their machines into first gear. The ground trembled violently as the massive convoy prepared to ride. "Let's roll!" Big Jim bellowed. The runaway mechanic stepped back into the swirling desert dust, clutching his life in his hands, watching as the most expensive motorcycle on Earth led the most dangerous men in the world straight down the highway, leaving nothing but thunder in their wake. The legend of the runaway mechanic spread through dive bars and garages from Vegas to Milwaukee. Caleb Hayes paid his debts and vanished, opening a quiet, unnamed shop somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. He never spoke of the Mojave, but every year, on the anniversary of the National Run, a single anonymous bottle of top-shelf bourbon arrives on his workbench, bearing a simple note: "Keep them running."